and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, 2 years into its term, the Madani government finds itself under the microscope. BERSIH has given Anwar Ibrahim's administration a grade of D, citing its failure to deliver on key institutional and democratic reforms. Now, is this verdict too harsh, or is it the necessary wake-up call to those in power that they do not have the luxury of time? So today on the show, we'll discuss this further. Joining me are the good folks from BERSIH, Muhammad Faisal Abdul Aziz, who's the Chairperson of BERSIH, and Ooi Kok Hin, who is the Executive Director of BERSIH. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Yeah,
thank you for joining me. Let's talk about this D grade. It's really been making headlines. So maybe I can begin with you, Faisal.
Yeah.
Talk to me how BERSIH came to this D grade, giving the Madani government a 2-year review of D.
Okay, thank you Melisa and AWANI for having us. Okay, just a brief about methodology of the assessment. Basically, we need to emphasize that the assessment mainly based on 3 main areas: electoral reform, institutional reform, and also civil liberty. So we don't talk about economy and so on because other party will, give assessment on that. And this assessment divide into 2 parts. First, manifesto accountability, which will comprise of 70% of the grade, and also the historical comparison between PMX and other 4, the most recent Prime Minister. So with regards to the first, manifesto accountability, we found at least the government have fulfilled 8 elements of the reform. Okay, for example, in terms of Fiscal Responsibility Act, amending the Sohakams Act, and several other reforms. But 9 are still within the pipeline, and the rest still unfulfilled. And with regards to the second, the historical comparison, Prime Minister ranked 3rd out of 5, all the most recent Prime Minister. So overall score was 45.8%, equated to D. But when we give D grade, it doesn't mean a fail, but it reflects the slow progress of the reform agenda implemented by the government.
It was I found the report to be quite specific. 45.8. So there were clearly marks that were missed by this administration. I want to talk about those 2 things that you pointed to, Faisal, the manifesto accountability and the comparison with past administrations. Let's focus on manifesto accountability first. How should we view manifesto promises or pre-election pledges or promises? Should you take a politician at their word during pre-election promises and then have them commit to executing those promises? Or as we have said before, a manifesto is just a manifesto. It's not a quote-unquote Bible, right? Kok Hin, how do you view when people say manifesto commitments are not really set in stone?
Yeah, thanks, Melisa. And I think that's one of the major pushback against this report by saying some of the supporters of unity government are saying this is a unity government. This is not a Pakatan Harapan or Barisan Nasional government. So therefore, you cannot hold us accountable to the manifesto points. I want to push back against that narrative by saying that a political coalition should be formed to fulfill the reform agenda, not to abandon it. If you form a coalition to govern, to obtain power, and then you disavow your election manifesto, isn't that saying something very clear about why you want power in the first place, not to implement reform, but for your own self-interest? Let me take a step back and say, explain why we do this. We are almost at the halfway point of this unity government's term, and we feel that it's time for a midterm review assessment of sorts. Okay, the analogy to think of it this way: they have promised you a lot of goodies and stuff during the election manifesto campaigning, right? And now it's almost separuh penggang. Think of this like a contract. We, the rakyat, is the commissioner, right? And the unity government, is the contractor. They canvass for votes based on these electoral, manifesto promises, reform promises.
Is it a contract though, Kok Hin? I have to push back on that. They're not legally bound to do this. So this is a social contract. This is a contract that politicians say, elect me and I will fulfill this.
Yes, that's right. So it's like that social contract where, okay, vote me in, I'll do these reforms. Now it's almost halfway point. I feel like contractor, we should check in the progress made by the contractor. Like doing the house renovation. You don't just check in when the house is almost done. You come in midway, is it correct? The plug is PowerPoint and so that. So that's the idea. And there's also pushback against people saying, who is BERSIH to give all this grading? Who are you? Who elected you to give this grade? Faisal has been receiving some backlash as well. But don't we all do this all the time in kopitiam, in columns, newspaper? Back then, some people calling for kerajaan gagal, rakyat hakim negara, and so on. The point of this midterm assessment, I encourage everybody to download and share it as well. It's an attempt to be more systematic, more structured in assessment. Assessment is not new. We evaluate governments all the time, and everyone in a democratic system and society deserves the right to criticize and evaluate their government. What we are doing now is to make it more systematic by introducing comparative benchmarking and also very objective grading. It's not what BERSIH thinks, whether the government has done this reform or not. We list it out point by point, reform item point by point. And if people are unhappy about those grading, let's rebut us on that point by point and show us what you have done.
BERSIH did something similar for the previous Pakatan Harapan government as well. If I'm not mistaken, I also remember a report card for the
1 year.
1 year, 1 year of Malaysia Baru, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so I want to hone in on the criteria that you use. So you're absolutely right, Kok Hin. There were clear criteria and a matrix of kind of a scope of skema jawapan, if I may use the peperiksaan term, right? Why focus on those democratic reforms, the electoral reforms, the civil liberties? There are many who say, actually, the Madani government has done plenty on economic reforms, subsidy reforms, fiscal reforms, civil government reforms, labour market reforms. I could go on. They have accomplished, I mean, to be fair, they have accomplished a lot in this time. I wouldn't say a lot. They have accomplished some in this time. So how do we think about what you're focusing on and this D grade that you've given versus what has been accomplished? Is that a fair, is it a harsh verdict? Is it a fair verdict? How do we think that through?
Yeah, actually, when we presented this assessment, we have set the premise, the early premise here that our main focus is about electoral reform, structural reform and civil liberty. Why we focus on that? Because, of course, BERSIH, especially on electoral reform, we have been championing this issue for more than 20 years. Even during Najib's time, we had a rally just for the sake of electoral reform and other civil liberties. And like you said, for example, with regards to any economic reform, we do not deny the fact there is a progress. Even we can see there are a lot of ratings made by JP Morgan and so on. There are international think tank and so on that can make assessment with regards to economic development in Malaysia. But BERSIH, we have to focus on our area.
Right.
And this is our area of expertise that I can see.
It's your raison d'etre, right?
Yes.
That's the reason for BERSIH's entire movement is to focus on electoral reforms.
Yeah. And it is, to be fair, when there is no, or maybe a little group that have, give assessment on this electoral reform. So why not BERSIH, we step up, to take leadership, to give assessment on this, to resuscitate the discussion on this matter.
Right. Hey, can I ask you, yes, go ahead.
May I also add to what Faisal said? Anwar Ibrahim and Parti Keadilan Rakyat, they came to power after 25 years of reformasi struggle. When we talk about administrative reform, when we talk about tata kelola, we are not saying that is not important, economic reform, we are not saying that's not important, but remember, under Najib, there's government transformation program, there's economic transformation program, NKRA dan sebagainya. Under Pak Lah juga ada reform immigration, that's why you can get your passport in 1 day. But the Anwar Ibrahim government's distinctive feature is reformasi. It's not just all this tata kelola, it's not just economy, but all these 25 years of reformasi struggle where you promise electoral reform, where you promise we will clean up public institutions to prevent another 1MDB 2.0. Have we done enough to prevent another 1MDB 2.0? We have not. Yeah. And the third, freedom of expression. Some of the cabinet members today were charged. Nik Nazmi were charged under Peaceful Assembly Act, Sedition Act dan sebagainya. why don't you unshackle these repressive laws today when you have the chance to do so after 25 years of struggle? This will be your legacy reform.
Right. Well, why do you think that there's been such slow progress on the democratic reforms, the electoral, institutional, and, as you said, civil liberty reforms, but we see progress in other areas? Kok Hin, do you have any observations as to why this government is so slow moving in these areas?
Yeah, I think in our overall assessment, we have indicated that the Prime Minister and his government is being quite overly cautious. I think they might have learned a lesson or two from the first PH government, 22 months government, right? Where they feel that some uncareful planning, for example, could lead to an anti-ISEP protest. So they want to avoid a repeat of that. But I feel that is not an excuse to do nothing. It's not an all or nothing. You can initiate some reforms, for example, by setting up a new electoral reform committee, like what was done during Mahathir's time. You can have bipartisan cooperation. Right now, the PMX and opposition is negotiating an MOU. Why not put some difficult, sensitive reform areas under the MOU instead of that 7 principles of public life and all that? Why not put key reform just like what Ismail Sabri did with the opposition back then? Why not negotiate for legislating eco-CDF, which is something the opposition want, in exchange for their fingerprint on electoral reform, so that they can't go out after this and say, oh, ini to bring down kuasa politik Melayu. Have bipartisan fingerprint so that everyone is on board with the reform agenda.
What about you, Faisal? What do you think? Why the slow progress on democratic and civil liberty reform versus other areas? And I do have to ask you, I mean, 2 years in, what is it that you would have liked to see?
Yeah, I think maybe to add on, there are perceptions among politicians saying that, you know, this democratic reform is, you know, not that popular as compared to economic reform.
Right.
You know,
this is what the Rakyat wants. The Rakyat wants economic reforms first and foremost.
Yeah. Okay, yes, economic reform is very important. You know, touching on the bread butter is very popular. But we need to bear in mind that when we talk about corruption, I think everybody have their own concern. Looking back at the 2018 general election, when people bringing down the government, that means, or that shows that people really care about corruption when they, for the first time, they bring down the Barisan Nasional because of MDB. And of course, people, you know, the whole Malaysian, I think, they believe the government need to do something to, you know, to address the issue of 1MDB 2.0. So they have to make a reform, separation of power between AG and PP, and they have to reform the MUCC because, you know, the current structure of MUCC, you know, being tested during 1MDB.
Yes.
So all in all, we need to reform, and it is not just, you know, the issue that only among the Bangsa bubble and so on, but I think the whole people talking about reform, especially to eradicate corruption.
Are you satisfied with the Prime Minister's response to this? I'm happy that he has actually heard your grade of him and his administration and has responded. So he said that he likened the grading to sitting for the UPSR examination and has vowed to score an A in the SPM examination. So how have you digested what how he has responded?
Okay, actually, we are not just referring to PMS response. Actually, but we welcome the response by PMS. At least it shows that he's not triggered through this degrade.
Okay.
But at least he's aware about, you know, the expectation from the people. And also not only PMS, but also we have you know, at least the positive feedback from YB Rafizi and also Fahmi Fazil. And last Saturday, I met with the Minister of Science and Technology, YB Chang Lee Kang, during one event, and we discussed a bit about this report card. He welcomed, I mean, what BERSIH is doing.
Okay. So the cabinet ministers are aware of how you're grading their performance so far.
Yeah.
Okay.
And even like several ministers, they give their pledge, I mean, to improve. But pledge is one thing, but looking at this, you know, assessment seriously is very important.
Yeah, for sure.
Moving forward.
Kok Hin, are you appeased by how Anwar responded?
We welcome the Prime Minister's open engagement, and in fact, we have to give him credit for being the first sitting Prime Minister to meet with the BERSIH leadership early this year in February. So that openness and, you know, ability to seek feedback from different actors is something that is very welcome, and no longer the era of government knows best and so on. At the same time, of course, we have to be very careful, as in we don't just take, you know, charming, sweet words as an indicator for reform. As we have shown clearly in this report, we are trying to bring in a new mindset of empirical assessment. So it's not what BERSIH think, it's not what Faisal think, it's not what me think. It's about empirical, real-world development. Like, has this reform been passed? Has new committee been set up to study this reform in progress? So it's a very empirical assessment. And to the Prime Minister and Law Minister, Dato' Sri Rajalina, and so on, we welcome your open feedback, but at the same time, we are also waiting to see the actual concrete empirical development.
Can I talk to you about this empirical assessment when comparing 2 years of the Madani government with previous administrations? So he's third out of the last 5 prime ministers. Anwar Ibrahim is third, comes up third in the last 5 prime ministers. Ismail Sabri's administration, what did he get right to come up top of your rankings, Faisal?
Okay, just to clarify, as we discussed just now, when we give the first rank of Ismail Sabri, we didn't say that Ismail Sabri is the best PM, but at least we have to acknowledge the fact that out of these 3 agendas, research,
okay,
reform,
so benchmarking against the 3 points that you raised earlier.
He outperformed the rest, and we can see, he himself managed to secure MOU with the opposition. He gave the CDF equal funding to the opposition. That means he tried to open up, the democratic practice in his leadership. And also, he managed to secure the anti-hopping law, because over the last few years before, we have Sheraton move, change of prime minister so many times. So he put a stop on this Sheraton move from being keep recurring again.
Right.
So, and then he execute the automatic registration, only 18. So we acknowledge the fact that he has done, even though not that much, but at least the progress is there, and he outperformed the rest.
So under his tenure, significant reforms were made.
And we did not deny the fact as well. People say that, oh, it was because the quality of opposition. Yes, we acknowledge the fact that during his tenure, because we have a very quality opposition, which is ready to, to sign an MOU with the government and also talk about reform, pushing the Ismail Sabri government to implement the reform. So both ways, I mean, Ismail Sabri outperformed the rest of Prime Minister, but also with the help of the opposition.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, the opposition. Ismail Sabri could not have achieved all the reforms under his tenure without that MOU, without the CSA, without cooperation of the opposition. Let's talk about the opposition. Yes,
but can I add to what Faisal was saying? So, I mean, we'll be very honest. We have 2 motivations why we introduced this comparative benchmarking. Number 1 is, okay, when we say Prime Minister perform atau tak perform, compared to who? That's very important because you can't evaluate a government in vacuum. So that's the first motivation. But the second motivation is really to answer people who say, well, you guys should be patient. It's only been 2 years. Be patient. You are being too impatient and rushing for all the reforms to be implemented. What we are trying to show here is that in 2 years, you can get a lot of things done. And we have seen Ismail Sabri get Undi 18, automatic voter registration, anti-hopping law that was advocated by the BERSIH leadership and all that passed. And I think when you say about significant reform, one way to evaluate how significant that reform is, basically, will the reform last beyond you? Maksudnya, it's not just macam I sebagai PM, I tak discriminate opposition. But I put in a new law that say I won't discriminate opposition. So that's a hallmark legislation, right? And his Undi 18 and all that basically emancipated millions of new voters. Another prime minister that scored above is Mahathir, right? And in this aspect, we are evaluating only Mahathir 2.0. That means the 22 March. It's not the first Mahathir. People get conflated. And actually, within internal BERSIH review team, there's a very heated debate about where to place Najib. And if we may walk into this, Najib has 2 phases or 2 eras. Najib's first term, when he came into power 2009, Najib basically ushered in a multiple reform agenda. He abolished the ISA, which took very big political capital to do that. And he tried to abolish the Sedition Act. He walked back later, of course. He introduced the Peaceful Assembly Act, which is not perfect, but it's far better than the Police Act that was used to regulate assembly, for freedom of assembly for a lot of activists. Now, that is, if we evaluate based on that first 2 years alone, Najib would have ranked higher than PMS. But eventually we put it in later because Najib's subsequent undermining of institutions during the 1MDB crisis really hurt our nation's credibility. That's why he ranked bottom. But what we are trying to say here, the main point is that under 2 years, you can get a lot of things done, and Anwar's predecessors have showed it. If they are not happy where we are replacing, well then, speed up the reform. You may get number 1 later.
Okay, so this is the wake-up call. I just come back to that question about the opposition. What grade do they get for the 2 years that they have been in opposition, Faisal?
Actually, we don't give grade to opposition because they are not government. But for us, it is very easy for the opposition to gain A if they perform well in the parliament.
It is an easy A. It's an easy
very easy,
to get,
but
yes.
unfortunately, because of still they don't have this concrete plan. Even though they announced the shadow cabinet, for example, but we don't think it is functioning well in terms of shadow cabinet. And then in terms of budget, now we have 2 years of being in the opposition. Still, there is no alternative budget presented by the opposition, and then they keep talking about like how to topple the government, and then now still they argue about who will be the next Prime Minister candidate. So let's talk about now what you as opposition can do or should do, because you are elected by the people. When you asking for CDF, for example, because of the legitimacy, you are being elected by the people. So you need to put that in your mind when you perform in the parliament. So there are a lot of things that we can discuss about the opposition, but we hope opposition can have it as a wake-up call as well.
Okay, well, what's your wake-up call to the opposition?
Our wake-up call is to stop bickering publicly and negotiate more privately, and also push the government not just to not discriminate you by giving equal CDF to you now, but also push for legislation to ensure that subsequent governments will not discriminate against opposition, no matter who is on which side. I think right now a lot of people are gambling in the sense that I want to be in government so that I can have the option to discriminate or not. But let's push for this MOU that will hopefully pass for major legislations. I want to sort of bring us back to the table of how we evaluate, right? Because I think we have mentioned electoral reform, institutional reform, but I think we have not. I think there are key details that opposition should push the government to. I think as Faisal clearly alluded, the opposition can do much more to push the government on reform agenda. Maybe this was the benefit of having quote-unquote PH back in the opposition back then, because they are quote-unquote more progressive and can push the opposition on this front. Right now, the government is not being pushed on that front. That's why civil society like BERSIH come in. Bukan kita nak jadi pembangkang, but we have to be the watchdog that hold the parties accountable. So we are talking about things like implement fair delineation, extreme malapportionment, constituency with like 500% the size of another constituency, reform public appointments of the Election Commission, MACC, amend Electoral Offences Act, absentee voting for Sarawak and Sabah voters who are working and studying here. Do you expect them to buy flight 1,000 ringgit each time? How about 18, 19-year-old university students? Can they afford to do that? Where's the term limit for Prime Minister and Chief Minister? Separation of power for AG and public prosecutor? Ombudsman audit report is done. That's credit to them. Fixed term Parliament. Parliament Services Act have not been done. PSA, despite they keep telling us every parliament sitting will be done.
It keeps coming up. You're right. You're right.
So so many of these things that I feel, some of it, Prime Minister, when we met him, we told him you can do this by yourself, executive decision. Some of it require parliamentary involvement. Some of it require 2/3 constitutional amendment. So you can do this. We are not semua nak buat hari ini, but hope to see some progress.
In the 2 years that the remaining term that they have, what is it that BERSIH would like to see prioritized? I mean, that's a long list that you've mentioned. Some can happen, but what would you like to see prioritized? Let's look ahead.
Okay. First, about PSA, Parliamentary Services Act. It had been, I think, more than 2 years since the engagement took place between government and stakeholders. Why PSA is important? Because PSA, when you have PSA, that means you recognize the autonomy of the parliament. So parliament can, have more budget. They can establish committees and so on. So having this kind of committee, at least they can do many check and balance in terms of vetting through the candidate, to lead the key institution like MCC and so on. So this is very important, key important. And even Wabi Azlina said that the draft is ready. So what should you wait?
What's the delay? Right?
What's the delay? So just present in the parliament for the next year and just endorse the PSA. And then there are other reforms as well that within the pipeline that we need to push over the finish line. Like for example, the celebration of power between AG and PP. Our concern, if it is not done within this mandate, even though Wabi Azlan said that, okay, it is within the pipeline, I mean, the discussion is there, but we need to push, as I said, so we need to buat bising lah. Otherwise, you know, it will keep delay until next election, or we don't have ample time to do that. And then plus others, like, of course, Election Officers Act, we talk about this many times, the audited EOA need to be amended, major amendment, not just terms of words used predated mendekade, but there are many things like the audited report, they need to be audited first before the candidate sent to the EC, and then the misuse of government machinery, and also there are many things.
These are the things that BERSIH has been pushing for, I mean, for the last 18 years
Yeah.
now. Right, okay. Kok Hin, if I may come to you in the last minute or so that we have left, what would it take for Anwar Ibrahim's administration to get an A in SPM? Can he still get an A at this point in time?
When I was younger, when I was studying for SPM, I reverse engineer how I would go straight A+.
How can we reverse engineer
all
this?
the subjects, and okay, these are the subjects I'm good at, these are not subjects I'm good at. Spend more time on the subjects I'm not good at. And for Prime Minister and his colleagues, all your subjects, all your scores are here.
Yeah.
In a way, we are already giving you the cheat sheet. The cheat sheet is here. It's clear-cut how you're going to score it. And I would say the most three important points, what Faisal I mentioned already, AGPP and Eco-CDF. I see this as very important, very urgent for political stability, because you can end up having people who try to buy, you know, MPs and so on based on this discrimination. We have to stop that. And of course, Parliamentary Services Act for more parliamentary reform. And if I may also mention one idea that we're trying to push when you mention about opposition, which is shadow cabinet. Now, a lot of people are saying, opposition is weak and not doing their job. Oh, well, can the government help them to perform better? Because I think we can. If we give opposition shadow cabinet, like allocation to embody research officers and all that, I think the rakyat will help them to a higher standard. Not just chipta any ratio issue and all that, but you're evaluating this person as shadow health minister, this person as shadow education minister. Where is the talking point for opposition? When government screw up, where is the opposition? I think we should head towards that multi-party democracy where opposition and government are both held to higher standards.
Gentlemen, it has been a passionate half an hour. Thank you so much for coming and talking about your report. I appreciate your time. Thank you. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.